The front desk phone rang in the morning, and the voice on the other end was shaking so hard the words barely came out. "There's a dog outside. On the sidewalk. He won't move. And ma'am, I think he's looking for someone who lives here." Nobody at Maple Grove Memory Care knew that 2 towns away, in a fenced backyard belonging to strangers, a leash had been chewed clean through some time after midnight. Nobody knew that a 13-year-old beagle named Charlie had pushed his broken old body through 19 miles of dark highway shoulders, drainage ditches, and half-frozen creek beds to get back to the one person who still remembered his name even when she couldn't remember her own son's face. When the nurse walked out that morning and saw him sitting there, ribs showing through his coat, paws bleeding, eyes locked on the glass doors like he'd been waiting there his whole life, she didn't call animal control. She called the one woman in room 11 Ford who hadn't smiled in 6 weeks. And when they wheeled her out and she saw him, she didn't say his name, she just made a sound. A sound like something breaking open after being sealed shut for a very long time. If you've ever loved an animal so much that giving them up felt like giving up a piece of your own soul, you already know where this story is going. And if you've ever wondered whether an animal can feel the same ache you feel when you're separated from someone you love, stay with this one, because Charlie is about to answer that question in a way that broke an entire nursing staff's heart and mended it on the very same Tuesday morning. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, and she was 74 years old when the doctors first said the word nobody in her family wanted to hear out loud. Early-stage dementia. The kind that starts small, misplaced keys, a forgotten appointment, a name that slips just out of reach, and grows slowly and cruelly until it takes everything. Eleanor had been a school teacher for 31 years in a small town in Ohio, the kind of teacher who remembered every student's birthday and kept a drawer full of Band-Aids and kind words for anyone who needed either. She had never married. She had never had children of her own, but 6 years before this story begins, on a rainy Thursday in October, she had found a shivering beagle puppy huddled under her porch steps, soaked through and crying in that high, thin way. Only puppies cry, and she had brought him inside and never once considered giving him back. She named him Charlie because he looked at her like he already knew her, like they'd met somewhere before this life and were just picking back up where they left off. And in the 6 years that followed, Charlie became the center of Eleanor's world in a way that nothing else ever had. He slept at the foot of her bed. He walked her to the mailbox every afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock, rain or shine, because Charlie kept better time than any clock she owned. He barked once, sharply, whenever she forgot to take her evening pills, as if he somehow understood the schedule better than she did, which, as her memory began to fade, he sometimes did. Neighbors would say later that Charlie wasn't just her pet. He was her memory, walking around on 4 legs, keeping track of the pieces of her life she was starting to lose. Have you ever had someone in your life who remembered things about you that you couldn't remember about yourself? That's what Charlie was to Eleanor, and maybe that's what makes this story so hard for some of us to hear, because we know exactly what that kind of love costs when it has to be let go of. The bond between them wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, the kind of love that doesn't announce itself but shows up every single day without fail. Eleanor's niece, Danielle, who lived 3 states away and visited when she could, used to say that watching Eleanor and Charlie together was like watching 2 old souls who'd found each other exactly when they needed to. Eleanor would sit on her porch swing in the evenings, and Charlie would lay his head across her lap, and she would talk to him about her students from decades ago, about her sister who'd passed, about a life she sometimes remembered clearly and sometimes couldn't remember at all. Charlie never corrected her. He just listened, the way animals do, with his whole body still and his eyes soft and fixed on her face. As the years passed and Eleanor's condition worsened, Charlie's role in her life only deepened. He learned the rhythm of her bad days versus her good days before anyone else could tell the difference. On the mornings when Eleanor woke up confused, unsure what year it was or where she'd put her shoes, Charlie would press himself against her legs and simply stay there, a warm, solid weight of familiarity in a world that had suddenly gone unfamiliar. Doctors would later tell Danielle that this kind of connection between a dementia patient and a beloved pet isn't unusual, that animals often become anchors, steady points in a storm of forgetting. But for Eleanor, Charlie wasn't just an anchor. He was proof that she still mattered to someone, that she was still someone worth coming home to, even on the days she couldn't remember her own address. There were small rituals that only the two of them understood. Every morning, before Eleanor even opened her eyes, Charlie would nudge his cold nose against her hand until she woke, as though he refused to let her start the day without knowing she wasn't alone in it. Every evening he waited by the door at the exact hour her favorite show came on, because somewhere in his sturdy little beagle brain he had learned that this was the hour she needed him most, curled beside her on the couch while the television flickered blue light across the living room. Neighbors who passed by her house in the evenings said you could set your watch by the sight of the porch light coming on, and a small shadow settling itself at Eleanor's feet. Do you have an animal in your life who somehow always knows when something's wrong before you even say a word? Hold on to that thought, because it's about to matter more than you think. The turning point came on a Wednesday afternoon in March, when Danielle drove in from out of state for what was supposed to be a routine visit and found her aunt sitting on the kitchen floor, unable to remember how to stand back up. Eleanor had left the stove on. She had wandered 2 blocks from home the week before, and a kind neighbor had walked her back. The signs had been building for months, but that Wednesday made it undeniable. Eleanor could no longer live alone. The decision, when it finally came, felt less like a decision and more like a wave that crashed over the whole family at once, sweeping away any illusion that things could stay the way they were. Maple Grove Memory Care was, by every account, a good facility. Clean rooms, warm staff, a courtyard with rose bushes. Eleanor would have loved under different circumstances. Danielle toured 3 places before choosing it, and she chose it because the head nurse, a woman named Patricia, had knelt down to look Eleanor in the eyes during the tour, instead of talking over her head to Danielle, the way so many people do to patients with memory loss. It was the right choice. It was also, in one specific and devastating way, the wrong one, because Maple Grove had a strict no pets policy, no exceptions, for reasons involving liability, allergies, and the logistics of caring for dozens of residents at once. When Danielle found out, her stomach dropped straight through the floor. She sat in her car in the parking lot after the tour and cried for 20 minutes before she could bring herself to drive home, because she knew what this meant. It meant telling her aunt that the one constant in her unraveling world, the one creature who had never once forgotten her name, would have to go. Eleanor didn't fully understand at first what moving into care meant. Some days she thought she was going on a trip. Some days she thought it was temporary, a stay while her house got some repairs done. But there was one thing she understood with a clarity that cut through even her worst days, and she said it to Danielle the night before the move, gripping her niece's hand with more strength than her frail body seemed capable of. "Charlie comes with me," she said. "Wherever I go, Charlie comes too." Danielle didn't have the heart to tell her the truth that night. She waited until morning, and even then the words came out broken and apologetic, because she knew, she absolutely knew, what she was about to take from her aunt. Eleanor's reaction wasn't anger. It was worse than anger. It was a kind of quiet devastation, a stillness that settled over her whole body as the words sank in. "No pets," she repeated, staring at the wall. "No pets." She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just sat there, holding Charlie's face in both her hands, memorizing him the way you memorize something you know you're about to lose forever. And Charlie, 13 years old, his muzzle gone gray, his hips aching in the cold, pressed his forehead against hers and stayed perfectly still, like he understood every word being said, even the ones that weren't. Have you ever had to make a decision that you knew was right and still felt like the cruelest thing you'd ever done? Because that's exactly where Danielle found herself, standing in her aunt's kitchen with a phone in her hand, searching for someone, anyone, who could give Charlie the home he deserved, because giving him up to a shelter at 13 years old felt like a sentence, not a solution. Danielle spent 3 sleepless nights calling every rescue, every family friend, every acquaintance who might take an aging beagle with arthritis in his back legs and a heart condition the vet had flagged the year before. Most people, understandably, wanted puppies, not a senior dog with medical needs and a personality built entirely around one specific woman. But finally, a coworker mentioned her cousin, a kind-seeming family 2 towns over named the Hendersons, who had a big fenced yard, no other pets, and a soft spot for older dogs. Danielle drove out to meet them herself. They seemed gentle. They asked good questions. They had a retired veterinarian technician for a mother, which felt like a small mercy given Charlie's health. It felt, as much as anything in this whole ordeal could feel, like the right choice. The day they took Charlie away was the day Eleanor stopped speaking almost entirely. Danielle remembers it in fragments, the way trauma often gets remembered. Not as a smooth story, but as sharp, disconnected pieces that still cut when you touch them years later. She remembers Charlie in the back seat of the Hendersons' car, his nose pressed to the window, watching Eleanor's front porch shrink into the distance. She remembers Eleanor standing in the doorway of her house for the last time, one hand pressed flat against the doorframe, saying nothing, her eyes following the car until it turned the corner and was gone. She remembers driving her aunt to Maple Grove 3 days later, and Eleanor asking, over and over, in a voice that had gone thin and papery with grief, "Where's Charlie? Is Charlie coming? Did somebody feed Charlie?" And each time, Danielle had to say some version of the same terrible sentence, "Charlie has a new family now. Charlie is safe. Charlie is loved." The first week at Maple Grove was quiet in the worst way. Eleanor stopped eating full meals. She stopped joining the other residents for the afternoon activities she used to enjoy, the sing-alongs and the puzzle tables and the gentle chair exercises out on the sun porch. Staff noted in her chart that she had become withdrawn, unresponsive to conversation, prone to staring out the window at nothing in particular for long stretches of the afternoon. Her doctor adjusted her medication twice, suspecting depression layered on top of the dementia, but nothing seemed to touch the hollow look that had settled into her eyes. Nobody in that building yet understood that the hollow look had a name, and that name was Charlie. But love, it turns out, isn't something you can transfer like a piece of furniture. And somewhere 2 towns away, in an unfamiliar yard with unfamiliar smells and unfamiliar hands, an old beagle with a bad hip and a failing heart had made a decision of his own. One that no one in that family, or Eleanor's family, or the entire staff of Maple Grove Memory Care, saw coming. The first 2 weeks at the Hendersons' house were, by their own account, heartbreaking to witness. Charlie ate almost nothing. He refused to sleep in the dog bed they'd bought for him, choosing instead to lie by the front door, facing the yard, as if he were waiting for someone to come get him. Mrs. Bax's. Henderson, the retired vet tech, said later that she'd fostered and cared for dozens of dogs over the years and had never seen an animal grieve quite like Charlie grieved. Not aggressive, not destructive, just deeply, visibly sad in a way that made her own chest ache every time she looked at him. He would sit at the fence line for hours, staring out toward the road, his gray muzzle resting on the top rail, his ears perking up at every passing car before falling flat again with disappointment. Have you ever watched an animal grieve for someone and understood, in a way that words couldn't quite capture, exactly what they were feeling because you'd felt it too? The Hendersons did everything right. They gave him space. They tried new foods, softer beds, gentle walks around the neighborhood to help him adjust. Mr. Henderson took him fishing down at the creek one Saturday morning, hoping the fresh air and the sound of moving water might loosen something in him, might remind him that life could still hold small pleasures. Charlie sat obediently at the water's edge the whole afternoon, polite and gentle as always, but his eyes kept drifting east, toward a direction that meant nothing to anyone but him, Mrs. Henderson began to worry, quietly, that they had taken in a dog who simply could not be consoled, no matter how much kindness they poured into him. But Charlie wasn't adjusting. He was waiting. And on a cold Monday night, 3 weeks after he'd arrived, someone left the side gate unlatched by a matter of inches, just enough for an old dog with nothing left to lose to push his way through and disappear into the dark. By the time the Hendersons realized Charlie was missing, it was nearly 10 o'clock at night. They searched the neighborhood with flashlights, calling his name into the cold air until their voices went hoarse. They walked the length of every street within a mile, checked under porches and behind sheds, knocked on neighbors' doors long after most decent people had gone to bed. They called animal control. They called Danielle, sick with worry, apologizing over and over, though none of it was really anyone's fault. Nobody could have imagined, that a 13-year-old dog with arthritis so bad he sometimes struggled to climb 3 porch steps would attempt what he was about to attempt. 19 miles. Through unfamiliar territory, in near-freezing temperatures, with no map and no guide except whatever ancient, unexplainable instinct lives inside an animal who has decided that one specific person is worth everything he has left. Danielle didn't sleep that night. She sat by her phone, terrified that the next call would be the worst kind of news. She thought about her aunt, tucked into a bed at Maple Grove, unaware that the one living creature who still remembered every version of her, the young teacher, the grieving woman losing pieces of herself every day, the person nobody else on this earth had loved quite so faithfully, was out there somewhere in the dark, walking toward her with everything he had left in his aching 13-year-old body. What Charlie endured on that walk, no one will ever fully know. But the evidence told its own story the next morning. Paws raw and bleeding from miles of asphalt and gravel, fur matted with mud from at least one creek crossing, ribs more visible than they'd been in years, from a body burning through every last reserve of energy just to keep moving forward. He crossed 2-lane highways in the dead of night, waiting in the ditch grass while headlights swept past, then pushing on again the moment the road went dark. He navigated around a town he'd never set foot in, guided by nothing but instinct and love, and whatever invisible thread still connected him to the woman he'd slept beside for 6 years. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, a trucker pulling into a rest stop later told police he thought he'd seen a small animal moving steadily along the shoulder, head low, moving with a strange, determined purpose that made him slow his rig just to be sure he wouldn't hit it. And then it was gone, swallowed by the dark, still heading the same direction. And somewhere around dawn, cold and exhausted and running on nothing but sheer will, Charlie found his way to the front doors of Maple Grove Memory Care and simply sat down, facing the glass, and waited. Have you ever needed someone so badly that you would have walked through anything, pain, distance, exhaustion, just to get back to them? Because that's exactly what an old, broken-down beagle did on a Tuesday morning in March, and what happened next would leave an entire nursing staff in tears. The morning shift nurse, a young woman named Renee who had only been working at Maple Grove for 4 months, noticed him first through the front window while she was starting the coffee at 6003 in the morning. At first, she assumed he was a stray who'd wandered in from somewhere nearby, and she almost called animal control right then and there, the way procedure dictated. But something about him gave her pause, the way he sat so still, so purposefully, staring directly at the doors like he was waiting for them to open for him specifically. She stepped outside cautiously, and that's when she saw the tags hanging from his worn leather collar, Charlie. And a phone number. She called the number, and it turned out to belong to the Hendersons, who nearly dropped the phone in shock when they heard where Charlie had been found, 19 miles from their home, at the exact facility where the woman he used to belong to now lived. It was Patricia, the head nurse, the same woman who had knelt down to speak to Eleanor eye to eye on that very first tour, who made the call that would change everything. She called Danielle immediately, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened, and then she did something that wasn't technically her job, wasn't in any handbook, and wasn't sanctioned by facility policy. She walked into Eleanor's room, knelt beside her wheelchair, and said, "Eleanor, honey, I need you to come outside with me. There's someone here who's been looking for you." Eleanor, who had barely spoken more than a handful of words in the 6 weeks since arriving at Maple Grove, who had grown pale and withdrawn in a way that worried her doctors and broke her niece's heart every time she visited, looked up at Patricia with something like confusion. But she let herself be wheeled toward the front doors anyway, because some small, buried part of her, the part that hadn't yet been touched by the disease eating away at her memory, recognized the tone in Patricia's voice. It was the tone people use when something impossible is about to happen. When the automatic doors slid open and cold morning air rushed in, and Eleanor's eyes landed on the exhausted, filthy, trembling beagle sitting on the concrete just beyond the threshold, something happened that no staff member at Maple Grove had witnessed in all their years working with dementia patients. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She didn't ask who he was or where he'd come from. Her whole body seemed to remember before her mind caught up, and she made a sound. Half sob, half laugh, a sound that came from somewhere far too deep to be manufactured or performed, and she reached both arms out toward him with a strength that surprised the nurse standing behind her chair. Charlie moved before anyone could stop him. Despite the raw pads of his paws, despite 13 years and 19 miles and a heart that hadn't been strong to begin with, he pushed himself up and crossed the last few feet between them and pressed his whole battered body against her legs, his tail beating against the wheelchair frame in a rhythm that hadn't slowed in 6 years and wasn't about to slow now. Eleanor bent forward as far as her frame would allow, burying her face in his neck, and the words that came out of her, the first full, clear sentence she had spoken in weeks, were simple, and they broke every single person standing in that lobby. "You came back," she said. "You came all the way back for me." Nobody in that lobby had a dry face. Renee, the young nurse who'd found him, had to step away and press her sleeve against her eyes. Patricia stood with one hand over her mouth, watching a woman who had barely responded to her own name in over a month, suddenly speaking in full sentences, laughing, crying, running her fingers over the same gray muzzle she'd memorized the morning she'd had to say goodbye to it. It wasn't a miracle in the sense of something that defied the laws of biology. Dogs have found their way home across impossible distances before, driven by instinct and scent and something science still can't fully explain. But standing there in that lobby, watching an old woman's soul return to her body through the reappearance of one loyal, exhausted animal, it was hard for anyone in that room to call it anything other than a miracle. Have you ever witnessed something so unexplainable, so perfectly timed, that you couldn't help but believe something bigger than coincidence was at work? Because that's exactly what the staff of Maple Grove Memory Care felt that Tuesday morning, and it's exactly what would set the stage for the fight that came next. Because as beautiful and impossible as that reunion was, it created an immediate and very real problem. Charlie needed medical attention, his paws needed treatment, he was dehydrated and malnourished from the journey, and the facility's no pets policy hadn't magically disappeared just because a dog had walked 19 miles to prove a point. Within an hour of the reunion, administration was already involved, and the conversation in the front office was tense. Liability, allergies, precedent, insurance. The words got thrown around by people who hadn't seen what everyone in that lobby had witnessed, people who were looking at a spreadsheet instead of a woman who had just spoken her first full sentence in weeks. Patricia, to her credit, refused to let Charlie be sent away that morning. She made an executive decision, one that could have cost her job, and had him examined by the facility's on-call veterinary consultant while Danielle was called and told to come immediately. When Danielle arrived 2 hours later, she found her aunt sitting in the courtyard, the same rosebush courtyard that had convinced her this facility was the right choice all those months ago, with Charlie curled against her side, his bandaged paws resting across her lap, both of them looking more at peace than Danielle had seen, either of them look in months. The fight that followed lasted nearly 3 weeks. Administration argued policy. Danielle argued documented medical evidence, because by then, Eleanor's doctor had reviewed her chart from the past 6 weeks and was willing to state, in writing, that her cognitive engagement, mood, and appetite had all measurably declined since her separation from her pet, and had measurably improved within days of Charlie's return. Patricia argued from the ground, quietly building a case within the staff, gathering testimonies from every nurse and aide who had watched Eleanor transform from a withdrawn, silent shell of herself back into a woman who remembered to ask about the weather, who hummed old hymns under her breath. Danielle didn't fight quietly. She wrote letters. She brought in a local news reporter who had heard through a mutual friend about the beagle who'd walked 19 miles home, and the story ran on the evening news 2 weeks after the reunion, a segment that ended up getting shared far beyond their small corner of Ohio, reaching people across the country who understood, in their bones, exactly why an old dog and an old woman needed to stay together. Viewers wrote in. Other families with loved ones in memory care facilities shared their own stories of pets left behind. A retired judge who'd seen the segment reached out to offer free legal consultation on behalf of Eleanor's family, citing a growing body of research and even emerging legislation in some states around therapeutic animal accommodations for dementia patients. Have you ever fought for something you knew, deep down, was worth every ounce of the fight, even when the people across the table were telling you it couldn't be done? The turning point in the battle came from an unexpected place. Not a lawyer, not a reporter, but from Eleanor's own physician, Dr. Ree. Marcus Feld, who had cared for her for nearly a decade. He submitted a formal letter to Maple Grove's administration stating, in clear clinical language, that Charlie's presence constituted what he called an essential therapeutic intervention for Eleanor's specific cognitive condition, and that separating them again could result in a rapid and potentially irreversible decline in her mental and physical health. He cited her improved appetite, her return to verbal communication, a measurable stabilization in her blood pressure that had been concerning her care team for months. He didn't ask administration to make an exception out of sentiment. He gave them a medical reason they couldn't easily argue against, backed by 6 weeks of documented decline, followed by 5 days of documented recovery, all centered around one dog. Administration convened one final meeting. Patricia was in the room. Danielle was in the room holding a folder thick with letters, news clippings, and medical documentation. Other families of residents, hearing what was happening, showed up outside the meeting room in quiet support, some of them holding old photographs of pets they themselves had lost or given up over the years when a facility door had closed on them too. And in a decision that would ripple far beyond Maple Grove itself, the facility agreed to a supervised pilot program. Charlie would be allowed to stay in Eleanor's room as a documented emotional support and therapeutic companion animal, with regular veterinary checkups covered in part by a small grant the local news story had inadvertently. The day the decision was finalized, Patricia walked into Eleanor's room to tell her the news, and found Eleanor sitting in her chair by the window, Charlie's head resting on her knee, both of them looking out at the courtyard roses that were just beginning to bloom for the season. Eleanor looked up when Patricia came in, and before the nurse could even say a word, Eleanor smiled. A real smile, the kind that reached all the way to her eyes, and said, "He's not going anywhere, is he?" And Patricia, fighting back tears for what felt like the 100th time in 3 weeks, shook her head and said, "No, ma'am. He's staying right here with you." Charlie lived at Maple Grove Memory Care for another 1.5 years after that Tuesday morning. He became something of a fixture at the facility, a quiet, gray-muzzled presence padding down the hallways on his bad hip, visiting other residents who had lost their own pets over the years and who found something healing in scratching behind his ears. Staff members said he had a way of knowing which residents were having a hard day, gravitating toward the rooms where sadness sat heaviest, offering nothing but his presence and asking for nothing in return. One resident, a widower named Walter who rarely left his room, began joining the other residents for meals again, simply because Charlie had taken to sitting beside his chair every evening, and Walter said it felt rude to ignore an animal who'd clearly decided he was worth the company. Eleanor, for her part, never fully returned to who she had been before the disease took hold. Nobody's story works that cleanly, and dementia doesn't reverse itself because of a happy ending. But she remained more present, more herself, more anchored to the world for those 18 months than her doctors had predicted, and every single person on that care team credited Charlie with the difference. Have you ever watched love do something that medicine alone couldn't quite accomplish? Because that's what happened in that quiet memory care facility in Ohio, one Tuesday morning at a time. Charlie passed away peacefully in his sleep on a spring evening, curled against Eleanor's side the way he had slept every night for 6 years before their separation, and every night for 18 months after their reunion. Danielle got the call from Patricia just after midnight, and she drove straight to the facility, arriving to find her aunt sitting quietly beside her bed, one hand resting on Charlie's still gray fur, tears running silently down her face. But tears, Danielle would later say, that didn't look like devastation. They looked like gratitude. Eleanor looked up at her niece and said, in a voice that was clear and steady despite everything, "He came back for me once already." I think that's the only miracle a person's allowed to ask for. Danielle drove home that night with Charlie's leash still sitting on the passenger seat, the one the Hendersons had given back to her, and she found herself thinking about all the ways this story could have ended differently. If the gate had latched properly that Monday night. If Charlie hadn't survived the highway crossings. If Patricia had followed procedure to the letter that first morning and called animal control before ever thinking to check the collar. Every piece of that Tuesday morning had depended on some small, fragile stroke of timing and courage, and Danielle understood, driving home in the dark, that she would spend the rest of her life grateful for every one of those small mercies stacking up exactly when they needed to. The staff held a small, quiet gathering in the courtyard the following week, among the same rose bushes Charlie had spent so many afternoons dozing beneath. Other residents came out in wheelchairs and with walkers, some of them holding photographs of their own pets, long gone or long left behind, and for an hour or so that courtyard felt less like a memory care facility and more like a gathering of people who understood, better than most, exactly what it means to love something that can't stay forever. Patricia read a few words. Renee cried, again, the way she had cried that first Tuesday morning, and Eleanor sat quietly in the middle of it all, her hand resting on an empty space beside her chair, as though some part of her still expected to feel warm fur beneath her fingers. Eleanor lived another year after Charlie passed, and the staff at Maple Grove say she talked about him often, always with warmth, never with the fresh, raw grief that had swallowed her whole the first time she lost him. Because the second loss, though it broke her heart in its own quiet way, was different from the first. The first time she had been forced to give him up, told no, told it wasn't allowed, told love had to bow to policy. The second time, she got to hold him until his very last breath, in her own room, on her own terms, surrounded by a staff who had fought alongside her family to make sure that never again would anyone tell her that the love of her life, 4 legs, gray muzzle, and all, wasn't welcome. Renee, the young nurse who had found Charlie that first morning, later said the experience changed the way she saw her whole job. She had come into nursing wanting to fix things, to chart progress in numbers and vital signs, and Charlie's arrival taught her something no textbook had, that sometimes healing doesn't come from a chart at all. It comes padding in on 4 paws with bleeding feet and a heart too stubborn to quit. She kept a small photo of Charlie taped inside her locker for years afterward, right next to her badge, as a reminder of what she was really there to protect. Maple Grove Memory Care changed its policy permanently after Eleanor and Charlie's story. Today, the facility has a formal therapeutic companion animal program, one of the more comprehensive ones in the state, directly inspired by a 13-year-old beagle who refused to accept that 19 miles was too far to walk for someone he loved. Patricia still tells the story to new hires during orientation, and she still tears up every single time she gets to the part where the doors slid open that Tuesday morning, and Eleanor said those 4 words that changed everything. You came back for me. So here's what this story leaves us with, and maybe it's something worth sitting with for a moment. We spend so much of our lives believing that love has to make sense on paper, that it has to fit inside policies and procedures, and what's convenient for everyone involved. But love, the real kind, the kind Eleanor and Charlie shared, doesn't ask permission. It doesn't check a rule book. It walks 19 miles through the cold and the dark on aching legs because some bonds are simply too strong to be undone by distance, by rules, or even by the slow, cruel progression of a disease that steals everything else. Charlie couldn't have known, in any way we understand knowing, the details of Eleanor's diagnosis or the policies of the facility that separated them. But he knew, in the only way that mattered, that he belonged beside her. And he was willing to give everything he had left to prove it. If you have an animal in your life right now who has loved you through your hardest seasons, who has stayed close when everything else felt uncertain, go give them an extra scratch behind the ears tonight, and maybe tell them thank you, even if they can't understand the words the way we do. Because somewhere, in whatever language animals speak love in, they understand exactly what we mean. Now, I want to hear from you. If you were in Eleanor's family's shoes, would you have fought administration the way Danielle did, or would you have looked for another way? And have you ever had a pet who seemed to know, somehow, exactly when you needed them most? Tell us that story in the comments below, because I promise you, someone reading this needs to hear it today. If you love these kinds of human and animal bond stories, hit that subscribe button right now, because every single week we bring you a brand new story like this one, real, raw, and made to remind you that you are never as alone as you feel. Give this video a like if Charlie's 19 miles moved you the way they moved everyone in that lobby. Drop your answer to those questions down in the comments, and we'll see you again next week with another story that's going to touch your heart.